Section 27 of Wildlife on a Norfolk Estuary by Arthur Henry Patterson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. East Coast Notes, Chapter 2, Some Fish Notes, Part 3. The Viper Weaver. During the summer and autumn of 1906, the numbers of the lesser weaver, Trachurus vipera, taken in draw nets and trawls, both on the coast and on Breydon, were in excess of those of any year I can remember. It may be that this phenomenally fine and warm period accounted for their abundance, as it undoubtedly did for the vast numbers of herring sile then found present in local waters. I have heard several persons speak of the painful consequences of contact with its ugly dorsal fin, although I have only known one or two seriously injured by it. No mercy is ever shown it on capture. I had never satisfactorily understood why the spines of this fish should be poisonous, and in certain instances I had concluded that there was a probability of the fish having come in contact with decaying animal matter, owing to its habit of grovelling on the sea floor. But at a meeting of the Norfolk and Norwich naturalists in November 1906, some interesting information on this point was forthcoming. Dr. H. Muir Evans of Lowestoft sent in a short paper on weaver sting, or trachinus venom, and Mr. J. O. Barley, M.A., gave an account of the structure of the poison apparatus of the weaver. The following is a condensed notice of these two communications, which were of more than local interest. There are two British species of weaver, Trachinus draco, the greater weaver, and Trachinus vipera, the less. The poison apparatus in both is the same. In each it consists of poison glands, resembling sebaceous glands in relation with grooved spines. These spines are 1. Those of the dorsal fin, which is coloured black, probably as a warning to other fish to prevent them biting. This fin, as the creature lies buried in the sand, is seen alone. 2. The opercular spine is more interesting. It has the form of a dagger, grooved along each edge, each groove containing a pear-shaped gland. The secreting cells of each gland are very large, elongated and arranged in columns. They give rise to an apparently colloidal and a granular substance, though whether these are successive stages of the same secretion or two separate secretions is unknown. There is no muscular arrangement for ejecting the venom. An eel catastrophe. In July 1905, one of the strangest and most destructive fatalities to eels I have ever known occurred to those in the waters of East Norfolk. The first intimation I received of it was by a postcard dated July the 19th, to the effect that on Sunday 3 rods got never a bite all day at St. Olave's, but there are scores of dead eels floating in the river, all in about the same stage of decomposition. The salts generally gets the blame. Eels didn't ought to mind salt water. I only saw one other dead fish, a roach. Signed, P.E.R. I went to see what was the matter with the fishes, and at first came to a wrong conclusion. Part of a letter I wrote to the county paper read as follows: Sir, on a ramble round last Saturday from Reedham and Haddiscoe to St Olaves, I noticed several dead eels floating in the river and, without giving much thought to the matter, concluded they had been pitched out of the eel babbers' stow boxes. It is their practice to place their catches in floating trunks until a certain time, or when sufficient numbers tempt them to return and sell their wares to the wholesale buyers. In these trunks there are usually weak and dying eels to be found, and as a dead eel is a fly in the ointment and soon decomposes, over it goes. Eels herein die from the results of pick stabs, hook swallowing, and such like. But the numbers reported by various folks at different places, and the fact of the majority being big eels, some up to 2 pounds in weight, as our Yarmouth ferryman assures me, must certainly point to something beyond ordinary accidents. Can it be that the recent hot weather has affected them in some way or other? I should be greatly interested in hearing whether this dead eel business has been more than local. A few days later a letter appeared signed Triton, who wrote, "Sir, no explanation on the problem of the dead eels referred to by Mr. Patterson appears to be forthcoming, and as the subject has an interest for a great many and has certainly been much speculated about, may I observe as follows. Like Mr. Patterson, I was recently at St. Olaves and noticed a lot of corpses of eels travelling up and down on the tides, and the same phenomenon appeared at Cantley on moving my boat thither. A few fish also were turned up at the latter place. Sailing up to Bramerton, I was told that many dead fish had been floating about the river. The fish give, I think, the clue to the mystery, if it ever was one, for an old eel catcher, whom I consulted, at once observed, 'I can say it, 'tis the sewerage.' Those who saw no dead fish, reasonably enough would not concede that sewage caused the mischief, but advanced ingenious theories of electricity, the eels getting into hot water, etc. Probably the Norwich authorities have been employing that grand natural drain, the River Yare, once more. If it is not so, let the negative be given to the suggestion. Cannot Mr. Patterson cooperate with the responsible authority at Norwich to gradually accustom our fish and eels to a scientific diet of sewage? Surely this should not be impossible to the intelligence which of late years has choked the Norwich River with weeds. Holidaymaker, referring to this subject in the Angler's News, said, "Dear Sirs, I have just returned from a yachting cruise on the Broadland waters, and whilst away I noticed in the Norfolk papers some remarks respecting the large number of eels which have died in the River Yare, etc. Now, I think the cause as put forth by a Norwich writer, that the sewage matter entering the river poisons the eels, is wrong, although this is corroborated by a well-known naturalist. Firstly, because although the eels are lying dead in the reeds in hundreds, there is no marked mortality among other fish, roach, bream, etc., just an occasional fish being turned up here and there. Secondly, it is well known that eels thrive near sewers and filth, and that they do not get poisoned. I think the writer really meant refuse from chemical works or something of the kind. But I want to let you know what I have seen. My trip has been to Wayford Bridge up the Ant, a tributary of the Bure. Well, there are no chemical works, no sewers or anything else of that nature there, and yet we sailed past eels turned up in vast numbers. In fact, in some places we had to give up the counting. I made many inquiries as to the cause of the eels dying off, and the major portion pronounced it to be the warmth of the water, and nothing else. One or two of the oldest inhabitants have recollections of something happening many years ago. No salt water has been up, and I am informed that, although the salt causes the eels to vomit, they are none the worse for it. I may say that a friend of mine also saw thousands of dead eels in the Waveney between Beccles and Yarmouth. My next letter to the Angler's News was as follows. Dear Sirs, I was interested in Holidaymaker's letter. Eels in Norfolk waters have turned up and died by thousands, some of them fine fellows. These fatalities occur only at long intervals. The fact of them turning up in the Bure, and high up there too, goes to prove that to sewerage and chemical waste all the fatalities cannot be due. After a number of inquiries, I have come to the conclusion that asphyxiation from the effects of the great heat upon the mud in which they delight to lay, and the decay of vegetable matter, has had most to do with it. The mud stinks. The decayed vegetation assists that stench, and eels are peculiarly sensitive creatures, although it is said they do not mind a temporary bit of burrowing into a decomposing corpse. How soon they will turn up in a floating eel trunk the eel babbers know, and watch for sickly tenants almost hourly in the busiest season. A dead eel soon goes wrong and spoils its living fellows. A dirty scum has risen to the surface and streaked white-painted yachts with an offensive and filthy banding, and it is a pretty good indication of the fermentation going on in the shallows below. A good few rains are badly wanted. For several days the rivers, especially where bordered by reeds, presented a gruesome sight, the floating bodies of the eels being threaded in and out among the stems, and weeks elapsed before the last traces of them had vanished. The summer of 1905 was an exceptionally hot one, with few tides of any strength. In fact, they remained abnormally low for a long period, thus creating the disaster and nuisance, and in no way helping to abate the unpleasantness of it. The eel-catching season of 1906, more especially on Breydon and in the lower reaches of the rivers, was a complete failure. 3 hooks, 4 fish. Culver, an old-time Breydoner, whose name is frequently mentioned in connection with a drain he once cut in the mudflats, and which has since deepened and lengthened considerably, once set 3 night lines at a sluice near the 7 Mile Car, on the Beccles River, and going to them next morning, found, to his great surprise, 3 eels and a pike fast thereon. The pike had been prowling around and evidently looking upon one of the eels as an easily procured supper, had seized it. But the eel was not to be so easily settled by Esox lucius, through whose gills it forced itself, and coming out under the gill cover, literally strung the unfortunate pike on the line, whereon, between the eel and a stake thrust into the margin of the bank, it was kept a prisoner. Large smelts. In the spring and autumn catches of smelts, and at other seasons in the year, large specimens are occasionally met with. The following are some examples. January the 14th, 1890. Example: 11 inches long, 5 inches in girth, 5 ounces in weight. January the 20th, 1890. Example: 11.5 inches long, 5¼ inches in girth, 5¾ ounces in weight. April the 22nd, 1890. Example: 11 inches long, 5¾ inches in girth, 6 ounces in weight. April the 22nd, 1890. Second example: 11 inches long, 5¾ inches in girth, 7 ounces in weight. April the 20th, 1891. Example: 12 inches long, 5¾ inches in girth, 6 ounces in weight. Cod's food. At one time, when large cods were frequently taken on long lines in this neighbourhood, it was a favourite amusement of mine to beg the stomachs from the various fishmongers and sort over the contents. It is surprising what a variety of species and a number of them a cod will gather and pack into its maw. I have found several herrings in one, fresh as when taken out of the water. Indeed, I have seen such herrings sold as fresh fish. I have found 17 Norwegian lobsters in one cod's maw, and various species of crabs in others. The sunfish. So far as I can ascertain, the oblong sunfish, Orthogoriscus truncatus, has not yet been recorded for the East Anglian seaboard, although specimens have been taken off the northeast of Scotland and also off the southwest coast of England. The short sunfish, however, has been several times recorded for East Norfolk, the last brought into Yarmouth, to the best of my knowledge, being one that had entangled itself in the herring nets belonging to a Scotch boat sailing out of this port. This was in October 1905. The arrival of this luckless and by no means handsome stranger caused much comment, and provoked considerable speculation among the fish fraternity haunting the fish wharf as to its name, habits, etc. I heard of its capture on the day it was landed, but was unfortunately unable to visit the wharf that day. It was snapped up by some daring purchaser for 4 shillings, and dispatched to a London fish shop to serve as a draw for customers, afterwards, no doubt, closing its career in the refuse box. As soon as I made my appearance on the fish wharf, quite a number of fishing folk surrounded me, and sought my opinion upon it, one man actually leading me to a rough pencil drawing limned on one of the fish merchant's office boards, and much humorous and dialectic argument followed. But every one was perfectly satisfied when I made a correctly drawn lightning sketch of the fish in question, wherein the sunfish's huge dorsal and anal fins were placed astern of it, and the odd little buttonhole of a mouth depicted at the other extremity. "That's it to a T," said more than one, and "I told you, 'bor, he'd tell you what it were," said another. My drawing and a short extempore lecture left them all knowing something more about the beast, and all good humouredly satisfied. By such means has one to arouse a little interest in strange creatures that come to their notice. In October 1892, Mr. T. Southwell, when writing to me with regard to sunfishers taken off the east coast, made mention of several captures, remarking, however, that he was not sure that his was a complete list. The following are well authenticated instances. 1667. Mr. Southwell's rendering of Sir Thomas Browne's account of this fish is thus quaintly given. Sometimes we meet with a molar or moonfish, so called from some resemblance it hath of a crescent in the extreme part of the body from one fin unto another one, being taken near the shore at Yarmouth before break of day, seem to shear and grunt like a hog, as authors deliver of it the flesh. Being hard and nervous, it is not like to afford a good dish, but from the liver, which is large, white and tender, somewhat may be expected. The gills of these fishes we found thick beset with a kind of sea louse. In the year 1667, a molar was taken at Monsley, which weighed 200 pound. 1821. One taken November 1821. Reference Paget's Sketch of the Natural History of Great Yarmouth, 1834. 1835. One from Yarmouth, now in the Wisbeach Museum. 1836. November the 13th. Example from Overstrand Beach, recorded in Miss Gurney's diary. 1843. An 18-inch example taken off Overstrand. 1850. November. 2 at Lynn and 1 at Salthouse. 1863. October. 1 at Lynn. 1865. Thornham. Example 4 feet 3 inches from nose to tail. From tip to tip of fins 6 feet. Weight 210 pounds. Recorded in the Field, January the 7th, 1865. 1887. September. 1 at Yarmouth. 1892. In first week in October, one was stranded in the River Nene at Sutton Bridge. 1896. September. I obtained a small specimen which had been captured in a didal or large hand net over the side of a trawler. The fish measured 18 inches in length and 2 feet 4 inches from the extremity of the dorsal to that of the anal fin. Weight 10 pounds. 1900. On September the 5th, a 2-foot example was taken in Yarmouth Roads. 1906. December. The following is a paragraph, date uncertain, from a local paper. A sunfish has been washed ashore upon the beach at Bacton, and as it was in a distinctly game condition, was ordered to be buried by the Custom House authorities. They reach a considerable size and have occurred from time to time along our seaboard. There are few things natural over which greater mistakes are made than fishes. Exaggeration of size and weight is not a failing confined to those who angle, and who make gross mistakes, undoubtedly more through ignorance than by design. But many persons who meet with curious sea monsters seem utterly without a sense of proportion, and many guess the weight of a specimen far above or below what it actually is. Instances of this occur in reports received by Dr. Day in his British Fishes and in the Field as above. The reader may compare a sunfish recorded by Dr. Day measuring 4 feet from snout to tail and 8 feet across the fins, which weighed between 300 and 400 pounds, with the measurement and weight given of the fish taken in 1865. Jago's Goldcinny. On June 5, 1906, one of my shrimper friends brought me an example of the Jago's Goldcinny, Tenolabrus rupestris, which had hitherto been unrecorded for Norfolk. It measured about 3 inches in length, and at first sight greatly resembled those white and almost colourless examples sometimes seen amongst goldfish. The black spot stood out boldly and well defined on the upper part of the caudal fin, at its juncture with the body, and at once attracted attention. Details regarding its habits seem to be bare and meagre. Living in deep water, it does not appear to be taken except by the merest accident in some crab pot, although occasionally indulging in nibbling at the fisher's baits. Dr. Day gives it a bad report from a gastronomic point of view, stating that it has flesh bad, soft, insipid, foul-smelling, of a greenish colour. But its reputation in this respect matters but little owing to its diminutive size. According to Day, it generally comes under notice through being stranded after heavy gales upon various parts of the coast. The above-mentioned example is now in the Tollhouse Museum. Topknots, megrims and witches. I notice the following paragraph in the Angler's News of December 29th, 1906. The columns of the Angler's News for near upon 2 months this year contain correspondence which resulted from the capture of a megrim, or witch, at Folkestone. Before that, many sea anglers were in blissful ignorance of either of these denizens of the deep, yet they must be common enough in some parts. Take the North Sea, for instance. During the years 1903-1905, nearly 200,000 hundredweight were caught in this sea and landed by steam trawlers on the east coast. During the same period, and from the same grounds, 51,000 hundredweight of witches were landed. The correspondence referred to began in the first week in January 1906, over the capture of an innocent little Muller's topknot, Zeugopterus punctatus, captured on the previous Boxing Day at a sea angling contest on Folkestone Pier. In the report of the competition appeared the following remarks. In the meantime, there were a few incidents to break the monotony and strain of 6 hours holding on, exciting sport. Mr. Clark, the proprietor of the local West End Photographic Company, brought down his tripod and camera and took some interesting pictures. Also a clever photo of a megrim, which fell to the rod of Captain H. I give the local name of this freak, which is really a mule or bastard fish, between brill, sole, dab and plaice. To all appearance, it might have been a cross between a sole, brill, flounder or sand dab and a rockling. Some other high-flown descriptive matter as to colouring, etc., was added to the above. I at once replied, expressing astonishment at the remarkable description given to the little stranger, and assured the readers of the Angler's News that there was a true species known as the megrim or scoldfish, to which, among other Latin synonyms, was added the generally accepted name of Arnoglossus laterna, and giving details, as far as known, of its habits and peculiarities. The report of a meeting of the British Sea Anglers Society, among other matters, including information with regard to the exhibition of the fish. Mr. Boyton submitted a fish very rare on the east coast, Zeugopterus punctatus, the whiff or topknot, Little Harry, in Cornwall, the brown fluke. It was certainly the finniest fish ever produced to the members. It was completely edged by fin. The tail even had 2 little fins. The prognathous lower jaw was a very marked feature. It was accompanied by a very nicely executed watercolour sketch. The next stage in the discussion was a letter of mine on January the 13th, giving a full description of the muller's topknot, with a pen and ink sketch, which was reproduced. Other letters for and against my "finding" appeared in subsequent issues, signed GC, WCN and WJC. The photograph was sent for my inspection, which proved at once and conclusively that the fish in question was no other than the muller's topknot. This, on January the 20th, I emphatically asserted in the same paper. Mr. W. J. Clarke, Fellow of the Zoological Society of Scarborough, identified the fish from my sketch and wrote an interesting letter upon it, dealing with its local status, as follows. Mr. Patterson's excellent sketch represents muller's topknot, Zeugopterus hirtus, being one of its many Latin synonyms, a fish which turns up in the trawls at Scarborough every now and then, not commonly, but sufficiently so as to have earned for itself from the fishermen the local name of velvet fish, from the peculiarly velvety feeling of the upper surface if stroked from head to tail. If rubbed the reverse way, the skin is rough and file-like, owing to the numerous small tubercles upon the scales pointing from head to tail. Many thanks for allowing me to see the photo, subsequently sent him, of the fish taken at Folkestone. I think there is no doubt that it is muller's topknot. I should imagine the capture of this species upon a hook to be of unusual occurrence. I have not before heard of one so taken, all the specimens I have seen having been trawled. WCN, in a letter on January the 27th, very properly complained of the babel of names given to one and the same and every species. He wrote, "Before leaving the Zeugopterus punctatus, I must remark, alas, another name, Zeugopterus hirtus, and what seems to hurt us most are its half-dozen or more aliases. What a pity it seems that our naturalist friends responsible for this are not more in agreement." Referring to this superabundance of Latinities, I replied as follows. Let me say that I cannot help every European naturalist picking his own pet's Latin name for the self-same fish. I suppose each one thinks his own the only correct and best one. Hence, when such small fry as myself have to sort over these names for our own lists, we usually pick which suits us best, although I prefer to be guided by him who is the standard authority of the time, and at present that man is the late Dr. Day. The winding up of a very animated and interesting correspondence upon the top knot, a fish which one might have covered with one hand, was reached on February the 10th, when a wire from G.C. to the Angler's News was announced as follows: Representing Folkestone at meeting of National Council for Sea Angling, I took the opportunity of looking up the authorities at the British Sea Anglers Society rooms for the purpose of settling once and for all, if possible, the question of the correct definition of my megrim. I am pleased to be able to support Mr. Patterson. The illustration in Dodd is an exact facsimile, including the two small oval fins depicted in the drawing of Mr. Nichols. In the course of this discussion, a note from G.C. was published respecting another queer fish. He wrote, "I send you a rough sketch of a peculiar fish of the sole order, called here a witch. It is taken occasionally in our trawls. The peculiarities are as follow. The underside is distinctly coloured, to all appearance, as if there were scales, although there are none apparent. The better description, perhaps, would be mottled. A neutral tone, about the colour or shade of a silver-tone photo. There is a bony ridge which runs from the apex of the gill and forms a nose. The eyes are set in bulbous cases so as to be used all ways. The mouth is small for the size of the fish, with very small tooth formation. There is a slight coloration of carmine on the left side of the snout. The tail is wispy, but the fins, dorsal and ventral, both voluminous and reach from the head to the commencement of the tail. The gills are close and in two curves. The colouring of the upper part is much that of the light-coloured sole, but there are distinct markings of a darker shade." The looked-for discussion on this new topic proved abortive. In my own reply, I simply stated that I have the witch on my list, giving its legitimate name as pole or craigsfluke, Pleuronectes cynoglossus, although the long rough dab, Hippoglossoides, Limandoides, and the locally rarer sail fluke, Rhombus megastoma, all on my list of Norfolk fishes, are by the fisher folk all classed under the silly name of witches. Here the witches remained until the above paragraph, dated December the 29th, 1906, appeared in the Angler's News. To this paragraph I replied as follows: Sirs, now about these witches. Witch is a trade name that covers a lot of, perhaps, indifferent eating sea flatfishers, and is really a genteel name for offal in the flat department. Smacksmen and others call the sail fluke, Arnoglossus megastoma, a witch. Naturalists term it as follows. Jago terms it Passer cornubiensis. Cuvier terms it Rhombus cardina. Donovan terms it Pleuronectes megastoma. Pennant terms it Pleuronectes pseudopalus. Risso terms it Pleuronectes boscae. Risso again terms it Hippoglossus boscae. Nilsson terms it Rhombus megastoma. Richards terms it Zygopterus velivolans. Collett terms it Zygopterus megastoma. Gunther terms it Arnoglossus boscae. Winther terms it Zeugopterus gotska. So you see what a lot of conjuring and mystification may be made with the shuffling of a few Latin names. The sail fluke and carter of couch are one and the same fish. This species grows to nearly 2 feet in length. I met with some nearly that length a few months ago in a fish shop. These had come into Lowestoft Harbour by a trawler and been carted to Yarmouth. We depend on Lowestoft for nearly all our trawl fish. I secured one and had it photographed, thinking it might come in useful some day. To the sail fluke as a witch may be added the pole or long flounder, Pleuronectes cynoglossus, termed by Linnaeus. This fish has a remarkably small head for its length, differing thus from the sail fluke, which has a whopper. The pole runs to 14 and 16 inches in length. One other witch is the long rough dab, Hippoglossoides limandoides, termed by Bloch, which is more like the sail fluke in its proportions. This does not run larger than 15 inches in length, according to Day, who gives that as the length of the longest known British example. But in January 1891, I obtained one 16 inches long. All these fishes are on my East Norfolk list. There is very little doubt that many unscrupulous fishmongers occasionally mix odd examples of witches with the true souls, for there is not much dissimilarity in shape to an inexperienced eye, although anyone well acquainted with the flavour of the latter would quickly detect a difference. A friend of mine, a local fish merchant, when on a visit to London, saw a big spread of these coarser fish, behind which the fishmonger had raised a huge ticket marked "Witches." On my friend laughingly remarking to the seller that he didn't know a witch when he saw one, the man promptly replied, "Oh well, it don't much matter, for a fine name suited them as didn't know what they was." End of section 27. Section 28 of Wildlife on a Norfolk Estuary by Arthur Henry Patterson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. East Coast Notes, Chapter 2, Some Fish Notes, Part 4. The Megrim. The first megrim, Arnoglossus laterna, I ever saw was given to me in 1903 by a fish hawker. It had been taken, so far as I could ascertain, in a trawl net, and in all probability was captured many miles away from my particular domain. I was fortunate in having one brought me on April 30th, 1906, which had been taken in a shrimp net within hail of Yarmouth Sands. In the same bottle of formalin, 2 Montague suckers, Liparis montaguei, bore it company. The fish was exceedingly sole-like in appearance and proportions, but was of a light sandy hue above, a fact which did not escape my observant friend. It had the appearance of having been dipped into hot water, and the remarkably tender skin had been broken and abraded. It is so difficult to preserve it intact that it has gained the suggestive sobriquet of the "scold fish." The length of this example was 4½ inches. A second specimen, slightly smaller, came to hand from the same source on July 30th, thus furnishing me with 2 examples in one season, of a fish hitherto unrecorded for Norfolk. Abnormal fishes. From time to time, curious and deformed fishes come to hand, and are always worthy of being recorded. The following examples have recently come under my notice. Stunted tubfish. On May the 23rd, 1905, my attention was called to a curiously stunted example of the tubfish, or latchet, Trigla hirundo. Its extreme length was 11 inches, of which the head measured 3 3/4 inches. Viewed from above, there was a distinct half-circular curve in the lateral portion of the fish, the tail assuming the normal position. The anterior half of the fish was abnormally thick. Deformed haddock. A haddock 13 inches in length had a most singularly curved hump on the back, below the first dorsal fin. Immediately at the commencement of the second dorsal fin, the back suddenly becoming depressed in a V-shaped manner, the third dorsal being situated on the top of the anterior portion between the right part of the V depression and the caudal fin. The lateral line ran exactly on the curves followed by the backbone. On dissection, I discovered 2 bony-like knobs formed by a coalescence of the vertebrae. In the following October, I obtained a codling with an almost similar curved body, with the angles slightly less sharp. Queer herring. A full-grown herring was brought to me on November the 28th, 1905, on the left side of which was a tumour the size of a 2-shilling piece. The fish looked sickly and exhaled an unpleasant smell. I quickly made a rough sketch of it and then cremated it. Stunted codling. On the same date, I have a record of a 2-foot codling, normal in shape save in the head, which was exceedingly foreshortened on the upper part, the lower jaw protruding some distance beyond the upper. When closed, the fish had a singularly weaver-like, sinister appearance. Curious place. A 12-inch place on a slab, among others, attracted my attention in December 1905 by a strange deformity of the tail fin, which grew at nearly half a right angle to the fish. What was more curious was the fact of one side of this appendage being tubular, as if the edge of the tail had been turned over and grown to it. I ran a pencil quite easily up this hollow. White roker. At the end of 1905, a friend reported to me having seen a perfectly white thornback ray, local name roker, on Lowestoft Pier, his statement being corroborated by 2 or 3 other persons, who, like himself, had gone over to purchase fish for their Yarmouth customers. Undercoloured plaice. I saw a £2 plaice on January the 18th, 1906, with both sides dark, save at the underside of the head, and with red spots on each side. On March the 1st, I examined another specimen, the underside of which was of a curious bluish colour, but no suggestion of spots could be traced upon it. White turbot. A £3 turbot was on sale in a local shop on June the 19th, 1906. The upper side was wholly white, with the exception of a thin brown ring around each eye and a faint splashing of brown on the edges of the surrounding fins. There were no tubercles or spiny processes on the upper surface, which are so characteristic of the normal fish. It was as smooth and glossy as a china dinner plate. Strange salmon. The queerest salmon I ever saw arrived in July 1906 from Scotland. It was a 6-pound fish with an extraordinary head. The upper part was as round at the foreshorten end as a cricket ball, the nose being turned under and flattened to the palate, the underjaw being of the normal shape, and standing out beyond the other considerably. The tongue, of the usual length, lay in the hollow of the lower jaw, but the distorted mouth shut to quite close and compactly. Red codling. On Christmas Eve 1890, I saw lying on a fish stall a codling of a curiously red colour, which answered in general appearance to Coucher's dorse, termed by Lynn as Gadus calarius. On August 30th, 1906, I met with another of a rich yellow-red colour. It measured 20 inches. It looked as if it had been carved out of rosewood. White flounder. A small flounder, white on both sides, was taken on Breydon October 14th, 1906. Short-lipped gurnard. A very ugly red gurnard was preserved for me by a fish vendor on November 7th, 1906. The upper part of the head was normal in shape, but the lower lip was remarkably shortened, extending but a few lines in front of the eye, and when turned over there was a peculiarly shark-like appearance. I do not think that this deformity was a freak, but am of the opinion that the fish at an early period of its life met with some accident. Short-lipped cod. During the same month, a 3-pound codling was caught off the jetty at Yarmouth with a precisely similar malformation, the end of the lower lip being but half the length of the upper one. In this case it was a genuine freak of nature. The specimen was preserved in a jar containing spirits of wine for my inspection. Spotted brill. A most beautiful brill, 11 inches in length, came into my hands early in February 1907. The upper side was pure white, with the exception of some 4 or 5 spots of the normal colour, each the size of a shilling, dotted along the bases of the dorsal and anal fins. Large flounders. My largest flounder record is of one taken in November 1889, which weighed 3 pounds 5 ounces. It was 19½ inches long, 9½ inches wide, and 1½ inches through it in the thickest part. One accompanying it weighed 2 pounds 15 ounces. If I remember rightly, both of these fishes were taken in a hoop net near the fish wharf, where, during the herring fishing, this species sometimes resorts in some numbers. The Angler's News of November 17th, 1906, cites 2 instances of large flounders being caught at Lee and Brighton, weighing 3 pounds 1 ounce each. I thought mine a record fish, but yield the palm to Southwold, a small fishing town in Suffolk, from whence came the letter appended. Large flounders. Sir, I notice your records of several flounders of unusual weight being caught with rod and line, so should like to give my own experience of these fish. I always manage to get my share of them up to 2 pounds each, but one Wednesday afternoon 4 years ago I took 2 fish only in 3 hours. They were 2 flounders weighing 3½ pounds and 2½ pounds. These were caught with rod and line off the end of Southwold Pier at low water. Yours truly, Robert J. Canover, Honorary Secretary, Southwold Sea Angling Society. The Flying Fish. The following note was sent by me to the Zoologist in February 1906 and may not be out of place here. The records in the Zoologist of the occurrence of flying fish on the Kentish coast are interesting, and recall to me an account of one whose fin was exhibited in the Fisheries Exhibition in London in 1883. I have hunted up the catalogue of exhibits made by the well-known Norwich naturalist Mr. T. E. Gunn, and find the following. Case 50. Flying fish. Fin of flying fish. Exocetus volitans. Specimen caught off Yarmouth, May the 23rd, 1868. Only known instance on this part of the eastern coast. I submitted it to the late Dr. J. E. Gray of the British Museum, who identified the species for me. For many years I have watched for an example to turn up, but as yet without success. I have not included this capture in my Nature in Eastern Norfolk for the simple reason that neither in the second edition of Lubbock's Fauna of Norfolk, nor in any of the Transactions of the Norfolk and Norwich Naturalist Society is Mr. Gunn's specimen referred to. It would be well, however, for all East Coast naturalists to be on the qui vive and help to more firmly establish the claim of this fish to be on the Norfolk list. I have been since assured by Mr. F. Leaney that this flying fish's fin is now in the Norwich Museum collection. Holibut Place. When passing through one of the back streets on August 17, 1905, my attention was attracted by a very queerly coloured fish lying exposed on the slab of a small fish shop. The fish was 16 inches in length, and its shape at once struck me as exhibiting a blending of plaice and halibut. The colour of the upper side was bluish ash, the edges, nearing the fins, assuming a Naples yellow tint, the surrounding fins being the same colour as the back, and the tail somewhat darker. Several orange-coloured spots, not nearly so pronounced as in an ordinary plaice, being sprinkled about on the upper side. The arides were straw yellow. The underside was milk white, with the splashiness characterising the halibut, the fin rays looking as if they had been daubed with lime white. I purchased the fish, which was, without the shadow of a doubt, a cross between the halibut and plaice, for a few pence. This fish, with several other interesting specimens, is in the Toll House Museum. An obstinate skate. A Bradener named Thacker, when rowing up the Duffels Drain on Breydon, was struck by a curious flapping movement on a flat as he passed by. It suggested to him the struggles of a wounded bird making ineffectual efforts to fly. He accordingly pushed as close to the flat as possible, and at once saw that a large skate, left stranded by the ebb tide, was flapping its great finny disc in vain endeavour to reach water or to realise its situation. Fastening his boat, he went on the flat with a bit of rope, which he hitched round the skate's tail, the fish remaining somewhat passive until he dragged it into the drain. The moment the monster, it was a good-sized fish, felt itself in its native element, it grounded and resisted all Thacker's efforts to pull it into the boat. In fact, it very nearly dragged him in too. It was only by patiently waiting until he could take the fish off its guard that he got its nose uppermost, and so brought it into a position where he could belabour it until it was too feeble to resist being dragged into the punt. Shark Incident. When recently recalling our experiences of sharks, my shrimper factotum, Colby, informed me that, late in the 60s, when he was engaged in midsummer fishing for mackerel in the Wold, they got a large shark, over 12 feet long, in the nets, making a nice old mess of some 15 of them. A fleet of mackerel nets then comprised 80 sections or nets. The shark, a bottle-nosed one, was landed on the beach by one of the ferry boats, and one or two of the crew made more money by an exhibition of it to visitors than was good for them, for they went back drunk to the vessel. On referring to Day, in his British Fishers Volume 2, under heading Lamna cornubica, or porbeagle, I find that a large shark is recorded by Mr. T. E. Gunn for July 4th, 1867, and the length given as 11 foot 5 inches. Day remarks, "The fish must attain to 11 feet or 12 feet in length if Mr. Gunn's was this species. It has several times been captured up to 10 feet. I have records only up to 9 feet. Skate luxuries. When I was a lad, dried skate was a favourite luxury among the poorer classes in town, more particularly loungers who spent their Sunday mornings in aimless loafings and gossips. Numbers made a pilgrimage to the inn of one Dilly Smith, who lived at the Suspension Bridge Tavern, immediately adjoining a bridge of that name. His fish house gable, still standing, in the finer days, used to be festooned with hundreds of skate of various sizes and species, mostly homers, or spotted rays, and blue skate. The latter was the favourite fish, being better flavoured and less spiny. Roker, or thornback rays, were by no means in request, owing to their formidable skin armour. After a long drying by wind and sun until the very blue bottles had given them up as a hopeless nursery for their broods, the already scored fish were cut into strips and sold at a halfpenny, a penny, and twopence a strip according to size and thickness. Queerer luxuries than these huge dishes of dried skate exposed for sale in the window could not be conceived, unless, perhaps, some wag of a shoemaker had replaced them by a display of worn-out boot soles, which they somewhat resembled. It was odd, but we got used to the sight of seeing a score men at a time gnawing the highly scented, curiously tasting morsels. I could never eat them myself, as they wandered to the quaysides or leant over the bridge, enjoying their leisure and their occupation. You would sometimes see their lips bleeding after their titbits had been devoured. Crates of dried skates were sent from the neighbourhood of Whitby. Sometimes the fish were nearly 3 inches thick. Women used to meet the boats with big bundles of them slung across their backs. Colby, my footless shrimper factotum, at one time sailed in the old Kate lugger with Gaby Thomas, afterwards a noted bradener. They used to catch a number of skate, which they gutted, tailed and ribbed, afterwards towing them overboard for 24 hours and then hanging them on the rigging to dry. 3 weeks or a month's hanging, according to the weather or the size of the skate, was necessary to make them sufficiently dry for sale. Those fish taken aboard already cured were often salted freely, a fact that rather pleased Dilly Smith, whose ale came in most welcome to assuage the great thirst provoked. There was a rather loose outlook kept by the police of those days on those who tippled on Sundays, and as the house had windows pretty well all round it, a policeman was visible a long way off, and possible eventualities were promptly provided against. Dogfish as food. Colby spoke very highly of nurses, which are larger spotted dogfish, or sweet williams, as food, either boiled or fried. Aboard the boats they ate the fish only from below the navel, that is, the vent. We chucked the other parts away. I believe this is the species known as bull huss on the southern coasts, where it is in request for food. Plague of dogfish. The summer and autumn of 1905 were remarkable for the numbers of voracious dogfishers that infested the western and southern coasts. Grave complaints were made of their ravages and their destructiveness to the nets of the fishermen. A London gentleman wrote to the Angler's News, pointing out how their presence and numbers might be turned to account by pursuing the dogfish in turn and utilising them for eating purposes. He wrote, "Sirs, I have read with interest the complaints of Cornish and Devonshire fishermen about the voracious dogfish. Many years ago Brighton fishermen made similar complaints, but they long ago learnt that the dogfish is one of the most appetising and nourishing of all fishes, and they eat both pin dog, or piked dogfish, and huss, larger spotted dogfish, with the greatest gusto, instead of cursing them, cutting their heads off and throwing them back into the ocean as was their custom once. I am glad to see these fishes now en evidence on fish stalls in London, because no fish is richer in nutritive properties. The flesh is firm, sweet, and far superior to plaice or haddock, as your readers would realise if they got over the natural repugnance the ugliness of the fish excites, and tried them as food fried or stewed as eels. If they are so plentiful on the Cornish coasts, they should well repay catching and marketing, and indeed I shall be much surprised if the Cornish fisherman has not already learned their good value, the more so as conger, a far inferior fish, is esteemed in a pie as a dainty of the highest excellence. There happens to be a saying that the devil himself never visits Cornwall for fear of being made into a pie, and if the good folk of Cornwall have not learnt the excellence and value of dogfish for eating by this time, I advise them to at once put it to the test, either as a pie, stewed or fried. Signed, M.H. G.C., in an enthusiastic note on the subject, launched out into the natural history of the various species, and detailed the various uses he thought dogfish might be turned to. This should not prove anything but a profitable undertaking, as the flesh is eaten. It is used largely by purveyors of the fried article, and, I understand, much appreciated. The livers yield good oil. The skins of both species of the spotted order are studded with tubercles of dentine capped with enamel, which make capital rub skin for polishing. The eggs also may be prepared as a delicacy. So it appears to me that, through ignorance or the national trait of improvidence, we refuse to make use of these much maligned species, which have really been placed in our waters for our benefit. I trust my items are correct, as with Mr. Patterson about, we laymen write in fear and trembling, and that my small endeavours may lead to some active dog battues, in which I trust that I may be invited to take part. Naturally enough, I joined in the debate, suggesting that there was little chance of killing the dogfish off, notwithstanding absurd proposals to decimate their numbers by the use of dynamite, which might prove as disastrous to the attacking party as to the attacked. To my mind, most of the species are far too much tainted by a flavour of ammonia to be really palatable, although I know full well many a one, beside other despised fishes, for example the wolf-fish and the stingray, are worked off in the fish shop frying tanks and doled out in slices to the hungry at supper time, the devourers never suspecting but that they are provided with primer joints than these. There are simple problems still needing solution. How is it that certain animals that prey on others themselves taste rank when eaten and others do not? For instance, the whiting not only devours other fishes but those of his own offspring, yet he is a delicate morsel. The sole devours mollusca and is himself delicious. Yet the scoter duck, which preys on the self-same shellfish, is by no means palatable by reason of its fishy flavour. Codfishers, besides knowing the gastronomic virtues of the Norwegian lobster and crabs, also devour herrings with almost proverbial greed. The dogfish fattens on herrings, yet he is by no means so dainty eating as the codfish. In my letter I referred to some amusing incidents respecting queer dishes I have sampled, and treated the dogfish subject in a rather cynical manner. Other letters followed, and, as is often the case, other subjects beside dogfish came into the correspondence, which, however, while it lasted, was by no means uninteresting. My letter of December the 17th wound up the discussion and was as follows. Sirs, whatever rascalities the dogfishers may have been guilty of, they have not altogether lived a purposeless life. They have at least imparted an interesting flavour to your correspondence column, which has been enjoyed on both sides of the table, apparently. I take it that the subject has been fairly thrashed out, and should not have referred to it again, only I tumbled across a strange item in my friend E. K. Robinson's delightful little weekly, The Countryside, a few days ago. It appeared in all solemnity that surrounds truth, and reads as follows. Effect of the War on Sharks. A curious effect of the war in the Far East is the migration of sharks to European waters. The submarine explosions are supposed to have frightened the creatures which, coming via the Suez Canal, have made havoc among the fish of the Adriatic. This has the smack of an Eastern fable about it. I myself have dared to suggest, in the Zoologist, that the incursion of so many steam luggers into the haunts of the herrings has driven away the larger sharks and various cetaceans from the locality. We have most certainly lived to see a great diminution of these once frequently taken sea monsters. What a pity our Allies did not label a few of the emigrants. Why did not the Marine Biological Association think of this before the war began? I have not yet fallen in with a nice fresh huss or doggy, and shall now postpone experiments until after the holidays. Your doggy enthusiasts must not altogether despair of me, but must exercise charity as well as patience. I would have all who know the dear delusive art, by which Coolina mollifies the heart, in pity to relent the brow severe, and o'er a brother's weakness drop the tear. I say, sirs, when you get diving in amongst the old classic gourmands, how does the spirit of envy creep in, and how you do come to fall into line with them until one can believe that, if, as Epicurus sings, all our joy from eating springs, him who most enjoyment follow, whose widest mouth and longest swallow. Introducing the dogfish. A rather amusing incident that attended the first really serious introduction of the dogfish as an article of food came under my notice late in January 1907. I was passing the barrow of a local itinerant fish seller when I noticed 4 long fish carcasses, skinned and ready for cooking, looking temptingly fresh and flaky. "What have you got there?" I asked. "Japanese flake," said the fish hawker with a wink. He is one of my scouts for things strange in the fish line. "They've got some Japanese name for it," he added. "They look nice, like young congers," I remarked, "or gurnards pulled out. But why not dogs?" "That wouldn't do," he replied knowingly. But he had the day previously, under pretence of introducing a new fish for the fish merchants, sold several at 2d. each, a penny a foot, and left some on trial to be paid for on the morrow. 1 or 2 did not want more, but some liked them so well that they paid up and asked for others. One cunning old man of the sea, whose wife had experimented at noontime, enjoyed her fish, and cooked one for his tea, refused to eat it. He knew it and didn't want hydrophobia. And the woman herself appealed to me to say if she was like to suffer any ill effects. But a neighbour's children overheard the suggestion of hydrophobia, and were frightened when it was explained to them by someone that it was a thing that made them bark like a dog, and the poor children had to be appeased with a dose of licorice powder as an antidote before they could be persuaded to sleep that night. I have every reason to believe that for some time past local purveyors of fried fish have sold dogfishes on the quiet as they did the wolf-fish, Anoricus lupus, long before they dared to acknowledge it, and the clamour for more attending the sale of the dogs above mentioned, which were piked dogs, the ugliest of all the species and of the most evil repute, argues well for a more extensive use of it as food, as well as its admittedly more toothsome cousins, the hussars or spotted dogfishes. Those who have partaken of these dogs describe the flavour as resembling that of the docks, the body portion of various skates. End of section 28. Section 29 of Wildlife on a Norfolk Estuary by Arthur Henry Patterson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. East Coast Notes, Chapter 3, Some Mammalian Notes. Water vole and crayfish. I have before referred in my book Notes of an East Coast Naturalist to the partiality exhibited by the water vole, Microtus agrestis, to freshwater fishes, and also to the swan mussel, Anodonta, and would not again revert to the subject did I think it would lead to the hurting of one solitary hair of the merry little fellow's back. I like his company too well, for of all my eventide visitors, when sitting out the last hour of evening in the stern of the moorhen, when moored in some solitary corner in Broadland, none has gratified me more by queer antics and innocent gambols. Wholly unaware of my presence, a pair of voles have come out on the bank to court and play, varying the fun of careless existence by daintily nibbling the coarse luscious grasses at the waterside, now chasing each other, now coyly making love, now sitting up as if half suspicious of being overlooked by they know not what. Happy little creatures! However, they must eat, and I have become fully convinced that their diet is of an omnivorous kind. When dealing with this subject in June 1897, I received the following letter: Aylsham, June 7th, 1897. I take the liberty of asking your opinion on a matter of natural history. I wish to ascertain with certainty, as I know you are a careful observer on these points. One day, the week before last, whilst fishing in the Bure between the junction of Scarrow Beck and Blickling Mill, I found about 20 large crayfish, or rather their remains, in little heaps by the edge of the river, the tail parts neatly nibbled in a groove along the middle of the back to enable the contents to be extracted. The big claws were eaten through about half-way for the same purpose. They were placed near the work of water voles. I took one claw from a hole. Around each heap lay the dung of voles. I have always thought the vole herbivorous, but I am inclined to believe it occasionally varies its diet with animal food, like the squirrel. The only others I can think of being the culprits are the common rat, the otter, and possibly the weasel. Mr. F. Norgate tells me he has frequently observed the remains of frogs in small heaps. I have toads chiefly, which he thinks the work of the water vole. Signed, R.J.W.P. Without a shadow of a doubt, these crayfish have been fished up by the vole and operated upon, as I have observed them bring to the surface the swan mussel and devour it, and although I never yet actually detected the vole making free with toads, I have seen that unhappy reptile minus toes in a position that clearly indicated an unexpected escape from the omnivorous rodent. I have been assured by an old eel babber, a man whose word I have always been able to believe, that he had on several occasions seen water voles run off with the skins and heads of red herrings thrown onto the bank after a meal in his houseboat. This was generally observed in very severe weather, when the poor things were hard set for a bit of grub. He had a small hand gun in his houseboat on one occasion. This he loaded one afternoon and fired at a vole, knocking it over with a herring's head still held between its teeth. He "skun" the animal and made a tobacco pouch of the pelt, which he carried about with him for several years. A friend of mine, a capable observer, informs me that he is quite familiar with instances in which the water vole has devoured the common frog. More black rat notes. In the January Zoologist of 1906, a friend of mine who has keenly followed up the vagaries of Mus ratus and its allies in the neighbourhood wrote to the effect that the two local races of the black rat, Mus ratus ratus and Mus ratus alexandrinus, appear to be increasing in numbers, several fresh haunts having been brought to my notice. Some young specimens of alexandrinus have been through my hands, and all appear to have darker tails than the adults, apparently due to the black hairs being closer together. I have recently had a fine old male of the Mus ratus ratus variety brought to me, which had some time previously lost its left hind foot. The tibia had been broken through at the middle, and the muscles had healed at the knee, leaving about 1/4 of an inch of clean bone projecting. The end of the bone was worn and polished, and the animal bore a rather ridiculous resemblance to a man with a wooden leg. The rat was in good condition, weighing 5 ounces full. The following measurements of it were carefully taken in the flesh: head and body 6 3/4 inches, tail 9 inches, ear 17/18 of an inch, vibrissae 2 5/8 of an inch, hind foot 1 7/16 of an inch. Signed P. E. Rumbelow. My note in the Zoologist of February was as follows. Mr. Rumbelow is, I think, correct in stating Mus ratus and its compeer Mus alexandrinus are on the increase hereabouts. I am constantly hearing of their appearance in fresh quarters, and of very little to their credit. Cats are very fond of hunting them, and eagerly eat them, leaving only the snout and teeth. The rats themselves are not averse to anything that promises the least nourishment, and are not above nibbling the toe of a sound sleeper. A house in which a babe was some time ago seriously mauled by black rats has since been shut up, for the smell of those poisoned after the carpenters had been at work has made the place as insanitary as it was before unsavoury. In warehouses, dates, eggs, jars of jam, anything in fact, is fish in their net. Passing a sail loft on January the 25th, a sailmaker asked me if I could do with a couple of rats, one of them a clinker, that is, an extraordinary large one. I gladly accepted them. One was a jet black male, Mus ratus, the other a very large example of Mus ratus alexandrinus. As it differs slightly from one referred to by Mr. J. G. Millay as coming from Yarmouth, in the Zoologist 1905, I have thought it worth recording. Measurements: head and body 8 1/4 inches, tail 9 inches, weight 7 1/4 ounces. Body of a smoke brown generally, with slightly darker hair on the back and of a lighter hue below. Both fell victims to their love of Russian tallow, not a scrap of which that sailmaker dare leave about at night, except some placed in a trap for their especial benefit and his own. A very tarry smell emanated from the hides of both rats, due to their having made their beds of such tarry twine as they found lying about the loft. I went with this sailmaker into his oil room, a place in which large cans of various oils were stored, among them being 2 or 3 containing herring oil, a product, curiously enough, boiled and extracted from the oily scum which floats to the surface of the enormous keelers or tubs in which the herrings are rinsed before arriving on the spits for smoking. Hundreds of thousands of herrings go through the tub before the filthy water, thick with scales and blood, is let off below. This oil is of a very greasy nature, and takes a long time to refine itself clear. The cans in which it is stored for the sailmaker's use are very lightly bunged, to allow for the expansion and contraction caused by atmospheric changes. The sailmaker assured me that the black rats would mount these cans and push over the bungs placed askew in the neck, and when unable to reach the oil with a paw, would dip in their tails. "That's right," said he. "Why don't they nibble your sails?" "Well," he remarked, "before we dress a wherry's sail, we have to mix a certain proportion of tar, and they draw a line at a tarry flavour." Albino Mus ratus. On January the 28th, 1907, one of my specimen hunters, a merry little fish hawker, brought to my house a queer-looking rat. "My cat only caught it an hour ago," said he, holding the rat in one hand and his cap in the other. "That's a regular novelty, and she'd jist killed 2 black 'uns afore she got that." "So you've got rats?" I said. "Bless you, yes, sir," he said, smiling. "We have a nice old time with 'em." The rat in question was just full grown and in excellent condition, for the cat had had her fill of the previous 2, and needed very little persuasion to part with it. By lamplight the coat of the animal appeared to be bluish white, suggesting to me the hue of an Arctic fox in summer jacket. The tail was of a creamy tint, and slightly shorter than that of a normal Mus ratus. The ears were greyish, and the head altogether of the true typical form. The eyes were gleaming red, with an opalescent tint, and almost as full and bright as in life. I forwarded the animal at once to Dr. S. H. Long of Norwich, who exhibited it, still in the flesh, with several other varieties of Mus ratus and Mus alexandrinus, which I had sent him from time to time, at a meeting of the Norfolk and Norwich Naturalist Society on the 29th. This albino example, which I believe to be unique, measured as follows: head 1 3/4 inches, head and body together 6½ inches, tail 5½ inches. Rat and oyster. Some years ago, in the palmy days of smacking, a deep sea fisherman brought ashore a ped, or hamper of coarse-shelled smack oysters. These he good-naturedly gave to the landlord of the since demolished Staff of Life on the North Quay, and they were deposited in a back store place to be attended to on the morrow. Early next morning a queer noise was heard in the storeroom as of something being thrown and dragged about, and search was at once made. To his surprise, the landlord discovered a large rat with an oyster firmly attached to the middle of its tail. It would seem that, attracted by the pleasing aroma of the shellfish, this rat had come to examine them, and had evidently drawn his tail by accident between the shells of a gaping oyster, which, on being so oddly tickled, instantly closed. It goes without saying that no persuasion on the part of the rat would allow the extraction of his caudal appendage, nor of access, unaccompanied, to his hole. Also that the owner of the oysters speedily settled matters with the objectionable admirer of his toothsome molluscs. Breydon rats. My boat shed on the edge of Breydon is never free from a pair of rats, which bring up their families in the midst of surroundings so damp that one wonders they may ever rear any at all. It is seldom that more than one pair frequent my location, probably because they resent intrusion, but I have noticed invariably that when I have taken it into my head to trap them, they are at once succeeded by another couple. They never do me harm by nibbling or destroying anything, but are annoying by their persistency in bringing shore crabs into the place, having ferreted them out from under stones and refuse when the tide has fallen, and by devouring them, leaving little piles of broken shells to mark the spot where they have their suppers. I have had occasionally to shovel out the debris. Now and again they bring in fish offal and other queer viands, never troubling to cast away the remnants, which produce at times, especially after a higher tide than usual, a strange and powerful odour. Curious cat's feet. For some years past I have known of certain domestic cats in Yarmouth remarkable for the unusual number of toes upon the forefeet. From observations I have made, and the particular neighbourhood in which these felines live, I am strongly inclined to believe that they are all more or less related. To someone's great regret, no doubt, a friend of mine secured one of these animals, its colour shall be nameless, which he informed me died rather suddenly soon after, and there was a black specimen, he believed unrelated, which he intended to capture at the same time, but it gave him the slip and has never been heard of since. He cut off the forefeet of the cat that died and kindly furnished me with an exceedingly good photograph of them. The left foot had 7 digits, the right one 6, 13 in all, a rather unlucky number for tabby. In every other instance, as well as in the present one, the cat's hind feet contained the normal number of toes. The pygmy shrew. The pygmy shrew, Sorex minutus, appears to be common in the neighbourhood of St Olaves, a few miles from Yarmouth, and is found in the marshy districts nearer home. The first example that came to my notice was a rather badly mauled little chap in a bottle of spirits, which my friend, Mr. P. E. Rumbelow, had taken from a cat, not the only one this particular animal secured for us for examination. Cats are, it seems, eager to pursue and kill the shrew, but probably on account of its queer odour, refuse to eat it. It is known to the young people in that neighbourhood as the ranny, a common name given to Sorex vulgaris in the country districts north of Yarmouth, where the animal is not uncommon, although I believe unknown around St Olaves. The pygmy shrew is not entirely nocturnal, but hunts around for its prey in broad daylight. Some seal notes. The common seal, Phoca vitulina, occasionally frequents the sandbanks on the Wash in some numbers, until lately, I believe, without the local fishermen taking much objection to their presence. Complaints, however, would seem to have been made quite recently, it being suggested that they frighten away the fish. This may lead up to some persecution, and so good a target may tempt those whose business or pleasure it is to carry rifles to try to reduce the numbers. The Lynn fishermen at one time used to net or entrap individuals, selling them alive to showmen for exhibition purposes. I myself, in my scheming days, had examples on show, my showman in ordinary putting them through their paces. Their barking suggested yes or no on command, and a tambourine was rattled in a lively fashion by a flipper when an animal was ordered to do so. Some seals, especially when captured young, become very docile and tame, whereas those taken when old are never tractable. When keeper at Preston Pleasure Gardens in 1884, I had a seal rockery and pond, wherein several were incarcerated. One large seal was so vicious that he would rush at me like a mastiff, and could only be kept at bay by my facing him with a stiff bristly broom. On one occasion, when letting in water from the lake above, a huge eel came through the large connecting pipe and began to dash about on the scarcely water-covered floor. Before I could get in to secure it, the large seal had floundered out and seized it. The animal very speedily snapped the eel's vertebrae in a number of places and swallowed it whole. On rare occasions a seal swims and drifts into this neighbourhood, and has a very restless time of it, being shot at by gunners, startled off the beach by pedestrians when bunched up on the sands for a nap, and anathematised by sea anglers. One day in November 1891, a seal made its appearance in the vicinity of the jetty. An angler had just hooked a codling, when something that a young urchin likened unto a corpse seized the fish and swam boldly away with it. To the fisherman's surprise, he immediately hooked the seal when endeavouring to pull the fish away from it, and at once essayed to land it. To this end he played the animal and gradually drew it near the shore, whilst eager spectators, lining the beach below, waited to give it a warm reception. But the seal took fright as it came into the breakers, and making a sudden dash, broke the line, taking a hook with it. It was subsequently seen in the neighbourhood of Scroby Sands, and probably got safely away, a sadder and a wiser animal. I well remember a grey seal being shot with a punt gun on Breydon in November 1882. More than one old Breydoner, who witnessed the massacre of the poor brute as it struggled to escape over the flats, have graphically pictured to me the rumpus and the outpour of blood that reddened the drain. Poor beast! A pound of shot sent into its head at close quarters would make a ghastly gaping wound. I am glad I was absent at the time. A rabbit yarn. Some 20 or 30 years ago, a certain lighthouse keeper, recently come to Winterton Lighthouse, a few miles north of Yarmouth, on getting settled, thought it would be advantageous to him to turn a bit of the sandy warren attached to the premises into a vegetable garden. Accordingly he set to work, and having delved it into the semblance of a garden patch, proceeded to plant it. For the first few days the young vegetables promised to flourish in their new quarters, and the "bunnies" on the adjacent warren had not yet got over their surprise and the fear of committing trespass. But one morning the lighthouse keeper came to his garden to find that something in the nature of a blight had visited one corner during the night. Somewhat puzzled, he replanted the ground, but next night more of his tender vegetables vanished, and he was still further puzzled. He dug, manured, and planted again, but with like result. He asked the village folk, who smiled and naturally suggested rabbits. The keeper watched and found it was so. He complained to H, the lord of the manor, and asked him to keep off his rabbits. "If you wish to grow greenstuffs," said the lord of the manor, "fence your garden in yourself." This the keeper did not see his way to do, but set to work on a much harder, if less expensive plan. He dug a trench 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep in depth all round the garden, hoping that it would be a sufficient barrier against the marauding rodents. One morning, after he had completed his trench, he visited it, and to his great surprise found a large number of rabbits prisoners therein. They had got in, but could not get out. I am informed there were over 100 animals entrapped. These he managed to kill and find a market for. "All right," said the lighthouse keeper, "this'll do. It's better than a fence." And he managed to dispose of nearly 700 rabbits before the lord of the manor discovered his loss and the cause of the cessation of complaints. H was one day surveying his warren when he espied the keeper acting in a strange and excited manner, and came up to the edge of the trench. "Why, man, what's this?" he gasped. "You're clearing my warren." "I'm content," replied the keeper, still knocking rabbits on the head as he pushed a big box in front of him, stowing the rabbits up as he went. "If you want to keep your rabbits, you'd better fence 'em in." And so H did, for he immediately ordered some rolls of wire netting, burying 3 feet of it below the surface and raising it several feet above, all round the garden. Rodents' teeth mishaps. Instances, though rare, of wild rabbits have been met with in which the foreteeth had grown to an unusual length, to the great discomfort of their unfortunate possessors. As is well known, the incisor teeth of rodents are continually growing, to supply the loss incidental to their gnawing habits. Thus it happens that if one or both incisors become broken, the osseous matter at the root of the tooth opposite still keeps pushing that tooth forward, and a preternatural elongation ensues. How such an unfortunate rabbit manages to feed is not easily explained, and trouble must eventually follow. In February 1895, I obtained a rabbit with both of the top incisors missing, the lower ones being abnormally developed, standing out very much after the fashion of an aged boar's or a babirussa's tusks, the points very nearly reaching to either eye. It was trapped in the neighbourhood and notwithstanding its infirmities was in fine condition, furnishing me with an excellent Sunday dinner. A rabbit was observed at Norwich at about the same time, with one incisor tooth grown and curved to a half circle. A friend of mine has a common brown rat preserved, which had grown an under incisor to such an abnormal length that it formed a complete circle, the size of a wedding ring, the tip end coming to within an infinitesimal distance of the part of the tooth protruding above the animal's lip. In 1884, when feeding some pheasants in an aviary, I saw the tail of a very large rat protruding from one of the corn hoppers, and immediately understood that an uninvited guest was dining therein. I seized a stick and stealthily crept behind it, whereon the animal, without the slightest show of haste, came out. I immediately knocked it down, and on picking it up saw that it was an aged individual, thin and emaciated, with the two upper incisors grown over and completely under its chin, preventing the poor beast from properly masticating its food, for each time it moved its jaws, the points of the teeth chafed the skin, which showed signs of contact clearly enough. A cetacean migration. A somewhat remarkable movement of cetaceans, presumably porpoises, took place in March 1906. A big procession of them being observed swimming through the roadstead. Various reports reached me respecting them, some persons insisting that they were scolters, or white-beaked dolphins, and that they were at least 20 feet in length. Allowance must be made for the difficulty of judging the length of moving objects in the sea. I made inquiries with a view of ascertaining whether others had observed them further north of the county, but met with no response. Mr. Lown, a local naturalist, assured me that he saw this shoal on the afternoon of Sunday the 19th. He believed them to be porpoises. They appeared to be about 6 feet in length, and their ranks extended almost from the Wellington Pier to the St. Nicholas lightship, a distance of considerably over a mile. They sprang out of the water 3 or 4 at a time. The water was perfectly calm, and any shoals of spring herrings in their line of march must have fared very badly. End of section 29. End of Wildlife on a Norfolk Estuary by Arthur Henry Patterson.